Wreck of the Explorer. 2 weeks. 2 long weeks of terrible weather and endless rowing through the water. Sure, he had some help along the way, but even then it was surprising that he made it back to civilization at all. After all this time, freezing, numb, and barely alive, his tiny yawl finally hit the shore of Kolbois Bay. At this point, he was too weak to go on by himself, and was eventually approached by some onlookers who then carried him to the nearest tavern. Surprisingly, he survived. Not just the last 2 weeks either, but also a catastrophic shipwreck that most sailors have nightmares about. He was one of the lucky ones. This was his story when he was finally able to tell it, but not everything about it seemed to add up. And unlike him, not everyone had made it back alive. Hello and welcome to Maple Moose Mysteries, the podcast where we take a look at unsolved Canadian mysteries and crimes, providing you with the context, history, and theories to draw your own conclusions. Few stories of survival that are worth telling have not been told to death, but perhaps we have one for you today. We bring you the story of Captain John Waddell, a prolific figure in his local community who was nearly lost at sea. He was an accomplished businessman, entrepreneur, sheriff, and sailor who was remembered fondly. Throughout his life, he was adept at trying new things. Though not all of his endeavors worked out, he was usually able to bounce back, and that left him with a substantial legacy. But all of this has been somewhat tainted by serious allegations of fraud and murder. These claims would live on past his own life, and the echoes of it continue to this day. It seems like nothing conclusive was ever determined, just many questions that came from his fateful sea voyage. Was he the victim of a tragedy, or a greedy trickster willing to go to any means to get what he wanted? Let's dive in. A respectable man. Before we get to the wreck, we need to know who we're dealing with. John Waddell was born in Scotland in 1818 to William Waddell and Isabella Bell, before his family immigrated to Canada and landed in southwestern Ontario. When he was older, John married Nancy Eberts from Chatham, Ontario. This city is where the Waddells would eventually go on to raise their 7 children. Waddell himself was an adventurous spirit, not only in personality but with his time and money. He had the business savvy to embrace new challenges, and this put him into connection with plenty of influential people throughout the country. He and his wife lived in the iconic Waddell House, now known as the Rosebank House, which still stands today as a historic landmark in Chatham. Locally, he was a business owner, and together with his wife and her brothers, they established what would have been an empire in the small city. Everything from retail spaces to hotels to steamboats they had a hand in, which boosted the economy and gave it firm legs to stand on. Waddell was not just known for his business ventures, he was also, as mentioned, a boat captain, a member of the local military militia, and even a well-respected sheriff of Kent County. His job as a sheriff would include hunting down people who were trying to avoid paying their financial debt, and if they couldn't pay, they would end up in prison until they did. Few would want to mess with John Waddell, but those who knew him spoke about him in a highly respectable way. Despite all of the success, it wasn't always smooth sailing for Waddell. He eventually decided to leave Chatham behind, after some poor investments and litigation involving Nancy's brothers after a deal fell apart and their partnership dissolved. Waddell was on the lookout for new opportunities, and the hottest trends at the time were less about real estate and more about gold. Waddell had heard the news, as many others did, that mining for gold across the country had become much more prominent. There were stories of untold riches being discovered in rocks and rivers, and gold fever was sweeping the nation. Everyone wanted a piece of it, including, of course, the government, who wanted to regulate it. In the 1850s and 60s, British Columbia became one of the go-to spots to get rich, with several substantial gold rushes throughout its history. BC was a few years short of becoming a province, and the influx of prospectors looking to make a score caused the local political powers in control of the region to accelerate the expansion of its economy. Construction exploded throughout the area, fanning the flames of discovery, and firm mining regulations were finally enacted. As a result of this, entire towns were born to capitalize on the prospect of wealth. Prospectors from near and far were drawn to the mining towns, not to mention because of the danger and adventures in the life of a miner. Waddell responded to the siren song that was prospecting between 1862 and 63. He made the long journey to British Columbia, leaving behind his family in the hopes that he would establish himself first. He promised to bring them out west once he had become settled. Even though he had a lot of experience, being a prospector was new to him, so it was good that he had plenty of skills to fall back on in the meantime. A glimmer of gold. Waddell eventually found himself in Victoria, Vancouver Island, which had only recently been incorporated, grown immensely overnight as a result of the gold rush push. The expansion was so aggressive that it led to a deadly smallpox epidemic that decimated the indigenous natives. Nothing was getting in the way of newcomers from settling on a piece of property as they looked to make a name for themselves, even if it meant someone's lives. In the waiting period before hopefully getting rich, Waddell supplemented his gold hunting with his time as a steamboat captain, creating friendships that he was able to leverage into the role of a bank manager at Victoria's First Bank. Considering all of his business experience, who wouldn't want someone with his resume running their operation? Soon, he was able to bring his immediate family over. They missed him greatly and were eager to settle into their new lives. The journey was not an easy one for anyone, much less a family with 7 children. This included Waddell's wife, Nancy, and their children, Bella, William, Anne, John Jr., Fanny, Henry, and Hamilton. Along for the ride was Waddell's nephew, Alexander, who, like his uncle, was inspired by the claims of riches and willing to help out with the kids. His perspective was documented and published in a book, The Honorable Alec. This gave insights into Waddell's motivations and further highlighted his drive for adventure. Nancy was ill for most of the trek across Canada, and the weight of the travel continued to burden her. She was more than relieved to finally be reunited with her husband. All this travel could come to an end. While Alexander went on to practice as a lawyer and eventually became admitted to the Supreme Court, the rest of the family settled into their new lives in a new home. Waddell intended to buy an even bigger home once prospecting began paying off. Everything seemed perfect, but tragedy soon struck, completely shattering his plans. The bank in Victoria that Waddell managed was robbed of all its valuables, and the owner of the bank, the man who hired Waddell, was a primary suspect. He essentially disappeared after the robbery, and Waddell was placed in charge of the bank's affairs, what was left of it at least. A bank without money isn't much of a bank, and soon it closed, and Waddell lost his position as a result. Now the clock was ticking. Waddell continued to follow the stream of news that trickled down, leading him from region to region in search of gold, and he didn't have a job to back him up. This additional burden proved too much for his wife and family, and they decided to move back to Chatham in the summer of 1865, not a year after they had arrived. Nancy did not share as high of hopes for riches as her husband, and she missed her family in the town that she knew so well. So much work, so much hardship, this strain eventually led to the end of their marriage. Whatever hopes Waddell had to make it big, he now would have to do so without the support of his wife. After some time, even he had to admit that the gold was just another bad investment, and he gave up on this dream, moving back to his home province soon after his family. The fateful voyage. With his time out west a failure, and his broken marriage left in its wake, Waddell continued to work hard. He remained a devoted sea captain, and even had a ship constructed in 1866 called the Explorer. He would often take this vessel on cargo runs throughout the waters of southern Ontario. He focused on the shipping of lumber, wine, and other commodities. He ran a small crew, and though the trips may not have been the fortune he sought, it would pay the bills at least for a time. But this simpler, seafaring life went out the window when he embarked on his final voyage of the season on November 8, 1867. He was bringing wine and milling equipment from Windsor to Owen Sound, and boasted a 2-man crew, a relatively simple job for Captain Waddell. But the crew and her cargo were not seen again, and it wasn't until November 25th when their captain washed up on the shore of Colpoys Bay. He was exhausted, barely alive, and, it seemed, the only survivor. He needed to be carried to the local tavern, but miraculously he was able to slowly recover. He gave an account of his recent weeks and what had led to the catastrophe. Waddell described his journey, how the Explorer had been met with a storm with pelting rain and gale-force winds. It was a battle just to keep everything afloat, and some barrels of whiskey had been ruined. Waddell claimed that his crew had taken some of the drink against his recommendations and were drunk. After a long night on November 11th, fighting desperately against the waves, the Explorer's cargo shifted so much that it brought its stern straight up, clean out of the water. Waddell sent his crewmen below deck in a desperate attempt to rebalance the cargo, as waves began to tear the boat apart. The waves crashed over the hold, and at this point the cargo shifted again with the crew inside, hitting them as water poured in, and they either drowned or were smashed to pieces. As the water continued to bash the boat, even flipping it on its side at one point, Waddell continued to stay with it and hold on for dear life. He had no choice but to abandon the soon-to-be sinking ship. He managed to make it onto his small yawl with one measly oar and detach the craft and set it adrift with him in it, as what was left of the explorer eventually sank and was lost. Waddell had escaped certain death, but he was far from being out of the woods. He now had to make the 10-mile journey to the nearest town, which wasn't even his destination as he was hopelessly off course. Already exhausted, he was fortunate to make it to shore where he was cared for and fed by a local native until he could continue the journey. Slowly but surely he rode, day after day, contending with more bad weather before he finally found his way back to civilization. Waddell seemed to have the uncanny ability to survive and come out the other side intact. Shortly after the wreck, he moved on and found himself settled in Goderich, Ontario, continuing in his work as a captain despite his brush with death. But the explorer wreck would not be forgotten, and many who heard Waddell's story were curious. Rumors began to spread, and the details of how his narrow escape had played out raised questions. His account made headlines throughout the local newspapers, which brought forth many self-proclaimed experts who had their take on it. It was mostly speculation and gossip that continued throughout the years, but abruptly ended in 1870. Waddell, on another voyage, this time with his son William, was caught in a storm, and he, his son, and the crew drowned off the coast of Kincardine. His luck, if you wanted to call it that, had finally run out. After a time, the fascinating story of John Waddell and the mystery of his wreck faded. A question of murder. Theories about the fate of the explorer were resurrected in 1882, along with the explorer itself, which was located and salvaged by divers. The ship was raised to the surface and searched. Why? I'm not too sure. Perhaps there were still too many unanswered questions. Whatever the reason for the timing, the divers who handled the wreck presented key details that cast further doubt on Waddell's claims. Their story found the headlines and included the bold accusation that Waddell's craft had been intentionally sunk as a part of an insurance scam. The valuables aboard would have been insured for what in today's money would have been $7.2 million. On top of that, it was alleged that the 2 crew members aboard had been murdered. Scuba diver R.J. McCullough, who featured prominently in many of the media interviews, had investigated and been surprised to find that instead of any cargo aboard the Explorer, they instead found stones below deck, enough to keep a ship at the bottom of the water. All major ship equipment seemed to have been removed, and large holes appeared to have been drilled on strategic parts of the craft. It was implied that the holes had been placed on the Explorer before it set sail, and the holes were plugged until the time was right. The cargo was thought to have been taken off the ship, hidden, and the holes were unplugged, where the ship was resigned to its fate. Other discoveries added fuel to the fire, including the part of the ship that held the 2 crewmen. Their bodies were recovered, but the cabin that they were in was said to have been locked from the outside. It was speculated that they assisted Waddell with his scheme before he locked them in and doomed them to their brutal death. Accusations of such a heinous crime, especially against a prolific figure who was now dead, sparked a wildfire. The response to all of this was mixed. Waddell may have been known for trying to make it rich throughout the years, but a scam that involved the murder of his crew? Not the Waddell that many people knew, the former sheriff and military man who had benefited the local community so much. Plenty of people were skeptical, not to mention the number of people who found the claims disrespectful to the family that were very much still alive. Other newspapers investigated the Explorer to give their assessment. Not all of them told the same story. The Goderich Star, for example, reported no suspicious signs of foul play, which infuriated the diver McCullough, sending him back to the papers to double down on his story. He alleged that these newspapers were just trying to bury the claims due to the Waddell family's esteemed position. McCullough even states that friends of Waddell had begun to bully him into being quiet. This seemed to have the opposite effect, and he continued to tell his suspicions to pretty well anyone who would listen. He even went as far as to say that he and the other divers involved would go to court over the matter if they needed to, but nothing of this sort ever materialized. McCullough was a respected diver and a credible witness. Regardless of the pushback, he continued to voice his claims. Some backed his side of the story, including divers, and even a sailor who had seen Waddell after the tragedy, making trips to the Explorer wreck. He was bringing back cargo that was supposed to have been lost at sea, and how did he even know where the wreck of the Explorer was anyway? But regardless of these strong opinions, no legal action was ever initiated, and the stories eventually lost the interest of the papers. After the Explorer was recovered, it was brought to port, fixed up, and eventually sold. The new owner encouraged McCullough and other outspoken critics to keep their suspicions to themselves. What good was it to hurl accusations at a dead guy? It hurt business. The Explorer itself continued to change hands, but its legacy was a string of disasters. After being repaired and set on the water again in 1883, it smashed into a pier and sank. Rinse and repeat, repaired once more, the ship returned to the waters it had crossed with Weddell before sinking yet again and taking its new crew with it. The ship, it seemed, was cursed. After this, it was not rebuilt again. Perhaps Weddell had also been cursed before he had drowned. Some saw him as the victim, a man who continually overcame challenges. Others saw him as a cold-blooded fraudster who killed his crew. The mystery surrounding his purported crimes carried on, and nothing official ever came from it. Like most things, people just moved on. The legacy of John Weddell is forever tainted after a life that seemed by all accounts to be decently well lived. But what about his family? Well, they had to live with the rumors and gossip, which must not have been easy, but many of his children thrived in the Chatham area. His former wife Nancy lived out her life in the house that they had bought, surrounded by her family until she died in 1900. Not all of his children's journeys were documented, but a few took similarly successful paths. John Jr., for example, went into business just like his parents. He and his younger brother Hamilton were responsible for the Toronto House grocery store that popped up with multiple locations in Chatham. After that success, he left the grocery life and joined a large grain company business. His impact on Chatham was also positive, much like his father, with a few reminders around town acknowledging his and the larger Weddell clan's history, including the house they used to live in and a dog park in John's name. Whatever the gossip about John Weddell Sr. and his untimely demise, the impacts of the Weddells cannot be understated. They still stand as an important economic and historical staple of this community. What do you think about the story of John Weddell and the wreck of the Explorer? Was he an unfortunate survivor of a tragedy, trapped in a legacy of misfortune and shamed for unproven accusations? Or was he a greedy businessman whose community ties only served to hide the dark intentions underneath? We might never know, but now we know the story. Let me know what you think by following me on Instagram at Maple Moose Mysteries and sending me a message. If you want more mysteries, crimes, unsolved Canadian stories, be sure to follow this podcast, Maple Moose Mysteries, and give me a rating. It helps me out and I appreciate it. If you do, hey, maybe we can grab a poutine sometime and talk about other Canadian stereotypes. I love maple, I love mooses. I'd love to see you next time when we have a new mystery to share with you all.